Braganza, and I'm talking to you today on behalf of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, a member of the Civil Society Financing for Development Mechanism, including the Women's Group on FfD. Let me begin by recognizing the submissions by the member states, especially from the republics of Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Seychelles, and Chad, whose experiences in addressing their debt crisis epitomizes the systemic weaknesses of the global financial and economic architecture that is skewed towards shareholders of capital and creditors at the expense of citizens in the global south. I think their statements are consistent with those that were made by the republics of Egypt and Zimbabwe in the previous session. Distinguished delegates and comrades from member states, this chamber is meeting at a time when there is an undeniable debt crisis that disproportionately affects countries and peoples from the global south. As we heard just a few moments ago, but also reiterated with great vigor last week at the IMF World Bank spring meetings, that there is an explicit denial that there being a debt crisis, or any crisis for that matter. But this begs us the question, at what point does a crisis become a crisis? Is it when creditors' balance sheets begin to be adversely affected? Or is it when people's lives are impacted by reduced access to health, education, and jobs and other public services due to the prioritization of debt servicing? Or is it when countries seek debt relief, but creditors play ping pong with whom should take the haircut, all the while the quality of lives of people in affected countries continue to deteriorate? Earlier this year, the LDC 5 conference in Doha in Qatar, the number of countries defined as LDCs 50 years ago since the introduction of the term has increased from 25 in 1971 to 46 in 2021. There is something very wrong with the global system that increases vulnerabilities and poverty of developing countries. Again, the presentations by the member states of Sri Lanka, Chad, Indonesia, Seychelles are lived experiences of the inadequacies of the current global economic and financial architecture. The debt situation facing the global south are not of their own making. And I think that the presentations that have been made today is important for us to take note of this. Developing countries, as I've mentioned by the Republic of Zimbabwe a few moments ago, have followed almost to the very last full stop, comma, and semicolon the advice that has been provided to them by existing IFIs, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in a world where debt financing has been the order of the day. And yet they find themselves in the predicament that we are faced with today, with that have created fiscal deficits, reduced fiscal space for production purposes, and hence generated a death by debt cycle for many developing countries that are vulnerable to global shocks, including rising interest rates and inflation, which increases the cost of debt, thus diverting resources from public services. This policy and political context constrains developing countries from moving up both the value and supply chains that would thus create domestic resource mobilization and reduce the reliance on debt servicing. Therefore, the discussions on debt relief do need certain urgent attention. I think there is general consensus in the room that the G20 Common Framework is not working for developing countries, and especially for the 5 countries that have applied to it, with only one successful concluded program, and that is Chad. And yet, we're yet to see how impactful that is likely to be. Therefore, what we need, as I wrap up, is something more radical, a debt architecture reform agenda that has real change with real solutions, as has been alluded to by the Republic of India in the previous session. And so as civil society organizations, we're calling for a multilateral framework that should urgently address building consensus on principles of responsible borrowing as well as responsible lending. The long pending issue of agreeing a common and binding set of principles on responsible borrowing and lending and ensuring compliance with it. This should address the gaps in transparency and advance towards the creation of a publicly accessible registry on loan and debt data, as well as facilitate organizing of debt audits. The debt architecture should also be assessments of systemic risks posed by unregulated and inadequately regulated financial sector instruments and actors, including regulation and supervision of the asset management industry, regulation and supervision of credit rating agencies. As we've seen, they have been fairly responsible for the slow uptake of the inadequate common framework, and a new global consensus on the critical importance of capital account management beyond pre- and post-crisis, both with respect to inflows and outflows. The civil society financing mechanism has made previous submissions on to the detailed UN independent experts on poverty and human rights on the role of credit rating agencies in this regard. Thank you very much.